Right, once you are in Globalization 1.0 Consequences Part 1, please download our fillable notes. Open up a new tab in the Cami extension. You should not be prompted to open a previous version because this should be brand new to you and your computer. We're going to be working on consequences for the next couple of days. Just to give you a heads up for that, there is no pair deck for this, just complete the notes as we go. And as we shift from motivations for globalization to consequences, it is important that we revisit our objectives. And of course, moving on, we see that we are at the right spot, looking at the consequences for this stage of globalization. That is going to help us prepare for the subsequent objectives, arguing for or against globalization and making predictions. As we get into this, we're going to see that consequences are a mixed bag. There will be positive, there will be good consequences, and there will be negative consequences and some pretty horrendously bad outcomes. We're going to start off with some good news, though, about Globalization 1.0. Trade increased. It's not going to sound like a lot. 3% per year for about 100 years. Yes, Memphis. Okay. All right, let's see what's going on. Again, 3% doesn't sound like a lot, especially if it's over an entire year. But what's important is that it's 3% per year for a century. And I hope you'll learn about this in personal finance because of something called compounding interest. That means that over this roughly 100-year period, international trade increased about 2,000%, or grew by 20 times. And so there was 20 times more trade at the end of that 100 years than there was at the beginning. To put it another way, a way that you'll understand because you've researched GDP and learned about GDP, it more than doubled over this time in terms of what it contributed to the global economy. And what really clearly makes this a positive is the effects that trade had on the countries that engaged in it. Countries that took advantage of the opportunity of Globalization 1.0 got a lot richer than those that didn't. This table shows us some countries in Europe, some of them large, Russia, Austria-Hungary, some of them mid-sized, France, Germany, Britain, and some small, Serbia and Belgium. In all of these cases, GDP gives us some usefulness, but because we've got such different sized countries, just look at population, what's really important is that we divide GDP by the size of the population. What we find there, our biggest trading nation, Great Britain, becomes by far the richest. Belgium, Little Belgium, also engages in a lot of trade. They also do some pretty horrible stuff in Africa. We'll get to that later. But they become also very wealthy. Same with Germany. And to a lesser extent, France. But France also, for a lot of this time period, had looked away from international trade. Our countries that were huge land empires but didn't do a lot of trade internationally, Austria-Hungary and Russia, remain much poorer. So trade was a good opportunity to increase wealth. It wasn't just about the countries as a whole. If we look at upper and middle classes within those countries, their living standards improved a lot. Again, we need to be clear that we're talking specifically about the middle and the upper classes in the West. And remember, the West refers to Europe or countries that had been largely settled by Europeans, places like Canada and the United States. We're going to take as an example for this something that John Maynard Keynes wrote about towards the end of Globalization 1.0. We use Keynes because, well, he's probably the world's most famous economist. His name will come across in the news year after year for the rest of your life. And he wrote that the inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. Other than the fact that the order is taking place by telephone and not by smartphone or laptop, you could think that John Maynard Keynes was writing in pre-pandemic London, right, and talking about Amazon Prime. He's not, and it wouldn't have been like the glory days of Amazon Prime where it really was 2 days or less from the time that you ordered. But still, this was amazing development, right? That you could order stuff from around the world and it would show up at your house. And we're talking in a matter of days, weeks. If you ordered something from across the globe, it might take a month. But a pretty astounding development. What was the source of this abundance for the middle and upper classes? Well, it was some pretty humdrum kind of developments in some respects. Talk about the Industrial Revolution, global trade, and the resulting global competition that went with all that trade. We'll start with the first part of that equation, the Industrial Revolution. And whatever else goes into the magic of the Industrial Revolution, right, the key is that it was the mass production of goods. And that was, in its own turn, made possible by something called interchangeable parts. Which is just something that we take for granted. We take it for granted so much that the definition of interchangeable parts is going to sound just nonsensically simple. One part would fit all of the products using that part. Take an example using this parts diagram on the right-hand side of the screen. Part 2 in this parts diagram, the barrel. This is a parts diagram of a Smith & Wesson Model 15 revolver. That barrel would fit any other Smith & Wesson Model 15. And if Cody orders one of these when he's old enough, right, he can order it with, that looks like probably a 2-inch barrel. He could order it with a 4-inch barrel, maybe a 6-inch barrel. And the only thing that's going to be different from gun to gun to gun is the length of that barrel. They will all fit. Right? It will fit any Model 15 Smith. And this means that it's now a lot easier to produce goods because you can change things up just like that. Right? Because all of the goods or model will use identical parts. It's easy to swap out. They're all the same. Does anybody here have family members who work on their own cars? Okay. Several of you. All right. If they want to do brakes on their car, whether drums, discs, whatever, do they have to take a rotor in to Advance Auto Parts and let them measure it, right, and then maybe send it to some guy out back behind the store that's going to fire up a little blast furnace, right, and hammer out a new rotor? Jose, that's not how that works. Well, that sounds boring. What do? What do you do if you want to go get new brake rotors for your car? Jazz, have you ever accompanied this family member to go buy parts? You have? Well, what do? When they go in and they want, let's say they want a brake rotor or any other part, what does the guy behind the desk ask? So part number, what if you don't have the part number? Like, oh man, I don't know.
Say what you're looking for and they'll be able to find it probably.
What model? Okay, yeah, so you tell them, right? I've got a Ford F-150, right? 1997. And they might ask which engine it's got. Well, it's got the 5.4 liter V8. They're like, okay, well, so is that rear drums and front discs? Yes, right? Well, you've told them about the model, and now they know, right? They're going to hand you a rotor, right? And if Jazz, who is the family member that does this? Your dad, right? If he takes those rotors home, he is absolutely confident that if he puts them together, everything's going to be right because he bought parts for a Ford F-150. That's the principle of interchangeable parts. Next up in this process is assembly line production. Using unskilled workers. This is where some of the magic of interchangeable parts in the Industrial Revolution will start to lose its luster. All those skilled craftspeople, right? Maybe Jose liked that romantic notion that when he went to get brake rotors for his pickup truck, that somebody was going to lovingly take them and take careful measurements and then make him new brake rotors by hand. Right? But no, sadly, that is not what happens. Right? These things are turned out mostly by machines and by unskilled workers operating machines. And the reason we don't need skilled craftspeople is because we've got interchangeable, mass-produced parts. In the past, you would have had a skilled craftsperson complete your good by hand from start to finish. Right? If you asked for someone to make you a pistol, right, they would hand make each and every part, and your pistol would be different than anybody else's. They might look the same, right, but they would be ever so slightly different. But now, all of the parts are the same, and each worker is only doing one part of the job assembling your product. So for Cody, there might be only one person in that factory fitting barrels to revolvers. That's all they do, right? Day in and day out. Right? Then it goes down the line, and maybe Amoriana puts in the mainspring in the handle. Right? But each of them only does their one task in assembly. Now, to use a different example, one illustrated here, in a moving car assembly line, one worker would take the wheel that goes on the front driver's side and put it onto the car. Another worker would then come along and fasten the lug nuts, right, to secure the wheel to the axle. That's it. We're talking about very broken down assembly. And again, by unskilled workers. I don't mean this as an insult, but this becomes very important to the story. When we put these two things together, right, the interchangeable parts and the assembly line, maybe this is where the magic comes back for some of you, it does allow goods to be made far faster than in the past and far cheaper than in the past. Yes. You're welcome. And it doesn't mean that the goods are worse. I would much rather have a mass-produced car that I know engineers figured out how to make, right, and then somebody turned them out all the same, than like a custom-made car, that every time something breaks down, I have to go get custom-made parts. Chances are really my mass-produced car will be better. And again, interchangeable parts mean that the final product can be made almost entirely by the efforts of unskilled workers. Again, the point I bring this up, it's not to pick on these workers, but it's that it has some important ramifications. It has some important consequences for the workers themselves. And one of those is that they become basically as interchangeable as the parts they work with. If Brody is hurt on the job, or if Brody quits, I can immediately go out and pull an Oliver off the street, and within maybe a day, maybe even far less, have Oliver all trained up to replace Brody. Because there's nothing special about Brody. He's an unskilled, no offense, Brody. There's just nothing, like in this system, there is nothing special about Brody. And Oliver, I know. There's also, I hate to break, nothing special about Oliver. Right? Because if Brody quits and then Oliver gets hurt, also replaceable. Right? And when people are that replaceable, the people are also cheap. Right? You don't have to pay them very much. Because again, they're not special. Right? You can train anybody. As long as they've got, the phrase was a strong back and a weak mind, they can do the work. Matter of fact, they can even be children. And the risk that Brody gets hurt on the job and needs to be replaced by Oliver pretty high. And that guy has got basically a little cauldron of molten steel, right, just a few inches from his feet, and he's pouring this stream of molten steel. Now he's wearing some fancy, probably asbestos leg coverings, but the accidents with this stuff are horrible, and lots of people die in the work. And we add the third part of our equation now, global trade. Right. With global trade comes global competition. If you want to make clocks, right, you have to compete with German cuckoo clock makers in Bavaria. Or clockmakers in Switzerland, or clockmakers in Massachusetts. This has consequences because of the comparative advantages. Different countries, different businesses in making stuff, plus that old invisible hand of market forces. People get the best goods at the lowest prices. Now, some of that is at least in theory, in some reality, especially if you guys ever read The Jungle in one of your ELA classes, or maybe a bit of The Jungle next year in U.S. history, you're going to learn that there was also some pretty horrible, disgusting products being turned out. But in a lot of ways, the quality of stuff you could get in this time period was amazing, and you could get it cheap. But this put pressure on businesses to keep their prices low. On this ad, I know it's hard for you to see, there are German scissors, I think there are English scissors and American scissors. You're competing on quality and price. Quality is in a lot of cases very similar, but so you've got to compete on price. And if you're going to compete on price, right, just as Karl Marx told us, you have to keep costs low. And just as included in your notes is an image of how global the competition was. This is an old Sears catalog cover. Cheapest supply house on earth. Our trade reaches around the world. And it did. Nana could order a house from Sears catalog. Right? It would show up. You'd have to build it, but everything would show up. Cody, when he gets tired of that Smith & Wesson Model 15, could buy a Thompson submachine gun from Sears Roebuck, and it'd show up in the mail. You get everything. And so one of the results is that things are a mix, but there is an abundance of cheaper goods for the people that could afford them. People in the middle class, and especially the bourgeoisie and the upper class. Right? If you are one of the people in either of those two groups, life is getting better for you. That's the good news. And when I was trying to find images of an automobile for this, one of the things I found for the very rich, even at this early 1900s, you could basically find go-karts for your rich children. Right? If you're the dad who's loaded, right, Zach gets his own go-kart. It's probably not that fantastic, but still beats walking. On the other hand, if you are a member of the working class, right, the proletariat in Marxist language, then you live a life of poverty. Right? Because remember, there's nothing special about you. You are replaceable. You have no skills. You sell your labor cheap. And also because you're cheap and replaceable, nobody cares very much about the cleanliness, comfort, or safety of your working conditions. And so this is a boy who, I don't know, you're probably wondering what that thing is. That's a little oil lamp, right? Because he works in a mine, underground where there is no light. And these are your living conditions if you are a member of the urban working class. A bunch of people packed into a dirty room, right? Sometimes sleeping in shifts. Right? Everything happens in that one room. Not pleasant. And in your next exercise, an ed puzzle that you'll be able to start before lunch and finish during seminar, you're going to learn some more about conditions of the urban working class living in these slums. But for now, please upload your notes document